The other Bennet sister sounds exactly like the kind of Austen spin-off I would love. Mary Bennet, the overlooked sister, finally gets her own story. But that premise also comes with a challenge, because there is a delicate balance with any spin-off. How much liberty should a writer take when reimagining a character? And how much needs to stay true to the original, especially when the original is as beloved as Pride and Prejudice? So in this video, I'll be looking at what the other Bennet sister changes, what I think works and what doesn't, and ultimately whether I think it is a satisfying continuation of Mary Bennet's story. This video will have spoilers for both Pride and Prejudice and Janice Hadlow's novel, The Other Bennet Sister. I won't be discussing the BBC adaptation here, but I'll be covering that separately in my next video, so subscribe if you'd like to see that. Yes, but with a caveat. I found The Other Bennet Sister to be warm, enjoyable, and pretty convincingly set in the Regency era. If what you're looking for is a story about the overlooked Bennet sister finally finding love, confidence, and a place in the world, look no further. But if you're a big Pride and Prejudice fan and you're particular about Austen's characterization, you may get pulled out of the story by a game of spot the differences, like I did. The book is actually broken up into 5 parts, but for simplicity, there are 3 main acts. Act 1 covers Mary's childhood, Act 2 retells the events of Pride and Prejudice from Mary's point of view, and Act 3 moves fully into new material set 2 years after the events of Pride and Prejudice.
2 years later.
If you know Pride and Prejudice well, Act 1 and Act 2 may feel overly familiar because we're moving through the childhood backstory and then recognizable events from Pride and Prejudice. But there is a clear reason why Hadlow includes these sections. They are there to reframe Mary. Based on the themes of the book, I think Hadlow's central idea for the story is this. What if the most awkward Bennet sister was not simply ridiculous, but lonely and misunderstood? We see how in the childhood scenes, Hadlow makes a point to explain how Mary became the plain, bookish, moralizing sister we meet in Pride and Prejudice. There's definitely an appeal there, taking a dismissed side character, giving her a full interior life, and showing how we all misunderstood her. There are many fanfictions out there that do this to great effect. But this type of continuation story is difficult to execute. You have to tell a new story while making us readers believe that this story could very well exist in the same world as the original Pride and Prejudice. Unfortunately, I don't think Hadlow quite executed it. When she focused on reshaping the story to be told from Mary's point of view, she was pretty heavy-handed in making Mary more sympathetic and likable. And in doing so, I think she fundamentally changed the character. In Pride and Prejudice, Austen tells us that Mary, in consequence of being the only plain one in the family, worked hard for knowledge and accomplishments, and was always impatient for display. This single sentence paints a very specific picture of Mary. Mary is plain, so she tries hard to be impressive in other ways. She has turned away from beauty, but not from the desire to be admired. And that is what makes Austen's Mary funny. Her sisters may be vain about beauty and attention, but Mary is not free from vanity either. Her vanity has just moved into a different, perhaps more respectable form. She wants to be admired for knowledge, seriousness, and moral superiority. In The Other Bennet Sister, the emphasis shifts. Mary's plainness isn't used to show how vanity can attach itself to things other than beauty. Instead, her plainness becomes the foundation of her insecurity and pain. Mrs Bennet's obsession with beauty and her obvious favoritism towards her prettier daughters make Mary feel like the failed Bennet daughter. But it also fundamentally changes what Mary's plainness represents. She becomes plain because she doesn't want to attract attention. Her plainness is a result of self-consciousness, shame, and insecurity. In other words, Hadlow turns Mary's plainness into a childhood wound. Emotionally, this works. It gives us a reason to understand and empathize with Mary. In Austen, Mary's plainness is tied to moral vanity. She's not vain about beauty, instead she's vain about being above beauty. From this lens, Mary dresses the way she dresses because she wants to set herself apart from her silly, appearance-obsessed sisters. Her plainness is her decoration that she is not like them. Hadlow removes the element of Mary looking down on her sisters and her mother by rooting her plainness instead in childhood wounds. And the result is, instead of Mary being just as vain and flawed as her sisters, her plainness becomes a symptom of how badly she has been treated by her family. The same thing happens with music. On top of being impatient for display, Austen tells us that Mary has neither genius nor taste, and her skill at the piano gives her a pedantic air and conceited manner. That description is very revealing. Mary has mistaken technical skill for artistry and good taste.
Miss Mary Bennet. See, you've anticipated me.
And most importantly, she is conceited about it, without the self-awareness to notice that other people are not impressed. The piano scenes remind us that Mary lacks self-awareness and good judgment. Hadlow again changes the emotional weight. In the other Bennet sister, Mary begins with a genuine love for music in her childhood. But as she grows older and realizes that beauty will never be in reach, the piano becomes her only hope of being seen. In Austen, Mary's music exposes a comic character flaw. In Hadlow, that same behavior is transformed into a childhood hurt that makes us empathize with her. The same pattern as Mary's plainness. And once you notice this pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. We have to talk about Fordyce's sermons. In Pride and Prejudice, we often see Mary quote moral language without substance. She reads the right books, but she doesn't know how to apply them to life. That is why her moralizing is funny. Mary has the vocabulary of wisdom without the judgment behind it. She is moralizing other people's actions without realizing how it makes her seem blind to her own faults.
I believe the rewards of observation and reflection are much greater.
And so they are, were there none others to be had. We shall have to be philosophers, Mary.
Hadlow again puts an emotional spin on why Mary is obsessed with Fordyce's sermons. In the other Bennet sister, Mary turns to the sermons because she feels excluded. Everyone else seems to be dancing to a tune that she alone cannot hear. So the books become a kind of survival manual teaching her how to act and behave. Again, the source of the flaw has changed. In Austen, Mary's moral reading exposes her lack of judgment and self-awareness. Hadlow's Mary turns to books because she doesn't receive love and support from her family. The result is that Mary's most ridiculous trait becomes understandable, even painful. For some readers, maybe not. These changes may be exactly why the book works for you. Most of us are very familiar with this kind of reclamation story. A character who was dismissed or marginalized is finally given a full interior life, and their point of view reveals a very different version of the story. There is real satisfaction in that, and I understand why Hadlow chose this as the central idea of her book. But I can't help but feel it was too heavy-handed. Those three examples, Mary's plainness, her piano playing, and Fordyce's sermons, they all have the same pattern. Hadlow twists Mary's character flaws into a childhood trauma. When the other Bennet sister gives Mary a sympathetic childhood and retells the story in a way that frames her as misunderstood rather than flawed, is that giving Mary Bennet more depth? Or is it giving us a different Mary, one who is softened to fit the familiar arc of the overlooked girl who only needed the right people to finally see her for who she is? There is nothing wrong with that story. It is comforting and familiar. I've loved stories with that exact arc. But the other Bennet sister is not just a loose Austen-inspired romance. It is structured as a continuation of Pride and Prejudice. It revisits Austen's scenes, sometimes uses Austen's dialogue directly, but then moves forward as if this Mary could have existed in the original story all along. So when a character's motivation or personality shifts even a little, the differences become very noticeable. And for me, this created a sense of dissonance. Take Mrs Bennet.
When you have 5 daughters, Lizzie, tell me what else will occupy your thoughts, and then perhaps you will understand.
In the other Bennet sister, most of Mary's character traits and learned behaviour can be traced back to Mrs Bennet's neglect of Mary. On the surface, Hadlow's portrayal of Mrs Bennet seems to be in line with Austen's. Hadlow's Mrs Bennet prioritizes beauty and is concerned with marrying her daughters above all else. So it is completely believable that Mary would feel overlooked in that household. But to make Mary's childhood hurt land, Hadlow often makes Mrs Bennet colder and more dismissive than in Austen. In Pride and Prejudice, Mrs Bennet is silly, shallow, and constantly plagued by her nerves. But her character is given depth because her obsession comes from a real practical fear of her daughters being left with nothing if they do not marry well.
So you shall all die old maids. We shall be turned out by the Collinses to starve in the hedgerows.
In the other Bennet sister, Mrs Bennet's treatment of Mary feels almost cruel. Her portrayal makes Mary's pain easier to understand, but the effect is that Mrs Bennet feels less like Austen's ridiculous anxious mother, who feels like a full character, and more like a mechanism for explaining Mary's character flaws. This is where I felt that dissonance. The characters are recognizable, but tilted slightly to make Mary's version of the story work. To a smaller extent, Hadlow does this with Mr Bennet and Lydia as well. Mrs Bennet's altered portrayal stands out to me because Hadlow shows that she can get this right elsewhere. I actually liked what she did with Elizabeth and Darcy. Later in the book, Mary goes to live at Pemberley. At first, when it's just her and Elizabeth in the house, Mary begins to feel that they might finally connect as sisters. But when Darcy returns, Mary becomes uncomfortable because she can tell he is uncomfortable around her. And that is consistent with Darcy's character. We know in Pride and Prejudice that he is reserved with people not in his intimate circle, so it makes sense that he's standoffish in Mary's presence. The same goes for Elizabeth. Mary sees how affectionate Elizabeth is with Georgiana, and it hurts her because she has never received that kind of sisterly warmth from Lizzie. Again, that feels believable. In Pride and Prejudice, Lizzie welcomes Georgiana with open arms while she barely speaks to Mary. I like this because Lizzie and Darcy do not need to become different people for the scene to hurt. Hadlow simply changed the angle and suddenly the characters we love in one story can become hurtful in somebody else's. I really like this part of Hadlow's novel because she shows how she can write a compelling story when she lets existing character traits create new consequences. The strongest example of this is Charlotte. In Pride and Prejudice, Charlotte is practical above all else. She sees her position clearly and she does what she needs to in order to secure a marriage.
I'm 27 years old. I've no money and no prospects. I'm already a burden to my parents.
In the other Bennet sister, Hadlow extends that practicality and shows us what happens when the stable life she has built feels threatened. Her practicality becomes self-protection and at times even ruthlessness. Because Charlotte values preserving her security and way of life above Mary's feelings. That worked for me because it grows out of Charlotte's existing character. This is exactly what I wanted for Mary. I wanted Mary's vanity and self-righteousness to create her conflict. I wanted the story to be about her making mistakes, recognizing them, and growing from them. Those flaws are not obstacles to make Mary interesting. They are opportunities to give her a satisfying growth arc. To me, that would have been a more accurate and interesting Mary Bennet story. Instead, the other Bennet sister gives us a much softer and more familiar heroine arc, a lonely young woman finding love and self-worth. It is enjoyable for itself. I understand why readers love it. But I wish Hadlow trusted Austen's Mary Bennet more. So my final thoughts on the book is this. The Other Bennet Sister is worth reading if you want a warm, sympathetic story about an overlooked girl finding love and her place in the world. But if you're interested in seeing Mary's story continue after Pride and Prejudice, I think the book fixes her a little too much. I'm interested in how the TV adaptation is going to handle this, so I'll be covering the Other Bennet Sister BBC adaptation in my next video. So please do subscribe if you'd like to see that. And I would love to know what you think. Did Janice Hadlow's version of Mary feel convincing to you? Or did you play Spot the Difference like I did? And if you're here because you love Pride and Prejudice, I also made a video about what modern romance stories can learn from Pride and Prejudice, which will probably be appearing right about here. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye!